Hello there. 0360 was at Accra, the largest gathering of stakeholders and leaders in the education industry. We had the opportunity to talk to some of the guests at the event about some of the problems in our education system and some of the solutions we can implement to ensure quality education in Africa.
Amina Belghiti, I'm a cultural entrepreneur and head up creative partnerships for Instagram. I think arts, and specifically arts education, is of huge importance. I think, when you realize that artists are, some of the more creative talent that we have, empowering them and finding ways for these artists to become future leaders and sharing that work and that thinking with a broader public is something that I think is extremely important. There are two things that I think come out of working more closely with artists. The first is critical thinking. So how do you actually come into contact with a piece of art and how do you understand it? And that's something that is very important to develop critical thinking. And then creativity. If you think about what it takes for us to be successful on the continent, I think innovation is key, and being able to be 2 or 3 steps ahead is going to require creativity, and the arts bring that exactly. I think, to me, what it comes down to with technology is scale. That's really what it brings. And so when you think about what it takes to be successful, you've got the ability for people to tell stories and to reach people in ways that they never have before, and to do that, at a scale that I think is unprecedented. And then in addition, I think when you actually realize that in addition to these stories being able to finally be told, to interact with communities in new and interesting ways is something that I think will make a big difference. So contribution to education is really linked to community and storytelling that really can be brought together at scale through technology. This was a fascinating discussion, and I think for me the piece that really stood out is this idea of leapfrogging. How do you actually step 2 or 3 chess moves ahead when it comes to education? And I think doing that in part through technology, but really through thinking about how technology needs to sometimes take a step back and allow that human connection to take place. And sometimes that's when technology is the most effective, is when it enables connections but then steps back and lets people actually take center stage. So we just created this nonprofit called the Pollen Collective, and the idea is to bring together artists, curators, and people from civil society to fund and support artists who are actually doing work in the public space. So rather than ask our youth to go to museums, to go to galleries, it can often be rather intimidating. The idea is, how do we actually support artists who are who have a social practice, who are typically as well social activists, in doing work that is actually going to be in the public space that engages people. And so we recently did a project in Dakar with a young artist who actually did work with the wrestling community, which is really interesting. So how do you actually invite wrestlers who are heroes to many of the young Senegalese boys and girls, and actually have them talk about a particular installation that they worked with an artist. And the idea there was to stimulate conversation about wrestling and about how that's changed over time, and specifically how materialism and consumerism has come into that. And so this artist and these wrestlers are wrestling objects, washing machines, fishing nets. These are things that people struggle with on a daily basis, and the idea is to encourage the youth to actually think about what they struggle with. Things that are usually invisible, they are now able to articulate. And so 300 young kids came out to actually see this art installation, and at first they found it very amusing that these wrestlers that they love were wrestling objects, not people. But soon the conversation started, and all of a sudden it became much more about values, and it became much more about how to actually think about unhealthy consumerism. And these conversations continued, and it's something that we hope to continue to have. And this is what art brings. It's that level of conversation. And because it happened on the streets, in their neighborhood, the artists came to them, they were much more open to that conversation and much more engaged, because they were actively involved in everything from the beginning to the end, from distributing flyers to bring people to the performance, to actually sitting with a radio host who actually commented the entire battle. And wrestling is something that is so important in Senegal. It's bigger than soccer and football. So this is something that is an interesting way to have a conversation about topics that you otherwise wouldn't have. I think for me, go out and meet these artists. Go and sit with artists who are doing interesting work. And as private citizens, we should all take the responsibility of meeting them and funding them if we can in their work. And so this is something that we have a group of people who are passionate about this. This is a new generation of people who want to support work that's a little bit different, and that's something that we're seeing, and we're seeing having massive impact with youth. To me, I think this is not something that is directly related to, a curriculum, but I think it can be. And so when you think about, the informal sector and lifelong learning, this is something that is of critical importance. So exposing youth to the kinds of ideas and questions that artists ask will help them develop critical thinking and creativity, and that's something that I think will position them extremely well in the business world, where they are not simply responding to what the job market wants, but rather creating opportunity in the future for future generations and themselves, obviously, as well.